There's something about that smile. You know the one season 7, episode 1, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be. Negan stands in that clearing with Lucille resting on his shoulder, and he's smiling. Not the wild grin of someone losing control, but something calculated, calm. Like a teacher about to deliver a lesson he's rehearsed 100 times. Everyone remembers the brutality of that night. Glenn's death, Abraham's final words. But did anyone notice the precision? The way Negan played that lineup like chess, reading every face, adjusting his approach based on who flinched and who stayed defiant. Back in Season 7, Episode 4, Service, he told Rick something that's haunted me ever since. In case you haven't caught on, I just slid my private part down your throat and you thanked me for it. Crude, yes, but accurate. What if Negan wasn't the monster? What if he was the only one who understood what survival at scale actually required? Let's explore that together. When Negan walked into the story in Season 6's finale, Last Day on Earth, he didn't just bring violence, he brought a system. And that's the detail I keep coming back to. Rick's group had spent 6 seasons fighting walkers, fleeing communities, barely holding together through sheer will and desperation. They survived. But Negan built something. The Saviors operated on a tribute model that was brutal but sustainable. Multiple communities, Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, Oceanside, all producing resources, all paying half their supplies to the Saviors in exchange for protection from walkers and other threats. It was extortion, yes, but it was also organization at a scale no one else in the post-apocalypse had managed. The governor tried to build Woodbury through deception and direct control. He maintained one fortified town, killed for personal satisfaction, and when that fell apart, he went on a revenge mission that destroyed him. Alpha and the Whisperers rejected civilization entirely, choosing to live as animals among the dead. Both systems collapsed relatively quickly. Negan's network? It lasted for years, supported thousands of people, created infrastructure, supply chains, and a hierarchy that, however morally repugnant, actually functioned. And the terror he used wasn't random sadism. It was calculated efficiency. One brutal kill at that lineup prevented months of ongoing conflict. Think about it. After Glenn and Abraham died, Rick's group submitted. The war didn't start for nearly a year. Negan broke Rick completely with 2 deaths instead of waging a drawn-out battle that would have killed dozens more on both sides. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was brilliant. Monstrous, but brilliant. The eeny, meeny, miny, mo selection wasn't just theater, though it was definitely that. It was psychological warfare. Negan chose Abraham first, the biggest threat in the group physically. But then when Daryl punched him in grief and rage, Negan killed Glenn as punishment. That wasn't impulse. That was teaching a lesson about consequences that everyone kneeling there would remember for the rest of their lives. One act of defiance costs a life. It's horrifying, but it's also exactly the kind of deterrent that keeps a large network of communities under control without constant violence. Rick's group fought walkers and tried to find safe places to hide. They were reactive, defensive, always responding to the next immediate threat. Negan was proactive. He built systems. He thought in terms of long-term sustainability, resource management, power dynamics. He wasn't just trying to survive the next week, he was building civilization, his version of it, with all the moral compromises that required. So here's the question I can't shake. Was he evil? Or was he just being honest about what power requires in a world without laws? Could Rick have built something this stable without becoming exactly what Negan was? Back in Season 7, Episode 1, there's a moment most people remember as pure cruelty when Negan forces Rick to the edge of breaking. But watch it again, and you'll see something else underneath. Negan doesn't just beat Rick down physically. He dismantles him psychologically, piece by piece, testing exactly how far he can push before Rick shatters completely. They're in those woods by the RV. Negan hands Rick a hatchet and draws a line on young Carl's arm. The order is clear. Cut off your son's arm, or I kill everyone. Rick is sobbing, broken, reduced to a man with no choices left. And at the last possible second, right before Rick brings that hatchet down, Negan stops him. He wasn't ever going to let Rick actually do it. The point was to break Rick's sense of control, to prove that Negan owned him completely, body and will. That's psychological warfare at its finest. Negan didn't need to actually harm Carl to achieve his goal. He just needed Rick to believe he would. And in that belief, in that moment of utter helplessness, Rick became Negan's. The physical brutality, Glenn's death, Abraham's, that was the stick. But this was the demonstration of total power. This was teaching Rick that resistance was not only futile, but would cost him everything he loved. And here's what gets me. Negan was reading people the entire time. He saw Carl's bravado when the kid snuck into the sanctuary later and opened fire. Instead of killing him, Negan recognized a younger version of Rick, someone who hadn't been broken yet, someone worth studying. He saw Eugene's cowardice and intelligence and immediately understood how to use both. He saw Dwight's fear and resentment and kept him close anyway, understanding that fear could be as effective as loyalty. Compare this to the governor. The governor used brute force and deception. He kept walkers in fish tanks for entertainment, staged gladiator fights, ruled through personal charisma and direct violence. When things went wrong, he went on a rampage with a tank. There was no subtlety there, no psychological sophistication, just rage and the blunt application of power. Alpha and the Whisperers represented a different, extreme, pure ideology. They believed humanity's attempt to cling to civilization was what destroyed them, so they rejected all of it. Wore walker's skin, walked among the dead, lived like animals. It was philosophically consistent, I'll give them that. But it was also rigid. There was no room for adaptation, no recognition that humans aren't actually animals, and that denying fundamental parts of human nature, the need for connection, for meaning, for hope, creates its own kind of brittleness. Negan was different. He used minds, not just muscle. Every interaction was calculated manipulation. When he talked to Rick, he was measuring responses, adjusting his approach, finding pressure points. When he recruited Eugene, he didn't just threaten, he offered comfort, status, security. He understood that different people break in different ways, and he tailored his methods accordingly. The pattern I'm seeing is this. Negan treated people like resources to be managed, understood, and deployed strategically. It's cold, it's ruthless, but it's also sophisticated in a way that suggests real intelligence operating behind the brutality. He turned enemies into weapons without firing a shot because he understood that the most powerful weapon isn't violence itself, it's the threat of violence combined with the promise of safety, wielded by someone who knows exactly how and when to use each. The Sanctuary's economy is where Negan's intelligence really shows itself, and it's also where the moral horror becomes most clear. During seasons 7 and 8, we got glimpses of how the system actually worked, and it was more sophisticated than anything else we'd seen in the post-apocalypse world. There were 3 tiers: workers, saviors, and Negan's wives. Workers labored for points, a currency system they could exchange for food, supplies, medicine. They did the hard, dangerous work that kept the sanctuary running. Saviors were exempt from the point system. They got better food, better quarters, and respect, but they had to enforce Negan's will without question. And then there were the wives' women who married Negan, not out of love, but out of desperation, trading their autonomy for medicine, for sick family members, for protection, for escape from the worker tier. It was exploitation, clearly. A class system as rigid as anything in the old world, maybe worse because it was enforced by direct violence rather than institutional bureaucracy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. The sanctuary supported hundreds of people. It had sustainable resource extraction from multiple communities through the tribute system. It maintained infrastructure. People had roles, expectations, a social order that, however unjust, provided stability. And then there's the I'm Negan philosophy. I've seen some people interpret this as distributed leadership, but that's not what it was. It was the opposite. It was cult-like identity erasure. Every savior, when asked who they were, responded, I'm Negan. Not as individuals, but as extensions of Negan's will. Their identities, their autonomy, all of it subsumed into one person's authority. It's chilling when you think about it. Everyone becomes Negan, which means no one is anyone. All identity, all power, concentrated into a single figure. Compare this to the Commonwealth in Season 11. The Commonwealth also had a rigid class system based on pre-apocalypse professions. If you were a senator before, you got luxury housing and political power after. If you were a server, you stayed in that tier even if you had skills that could contribute more. It was institutional oppression, structured and bureaucratic. The sanctuary's oppression was personal, based on loyalty to Negan, utility to his vision, willingness to submit to his authority. Different mechanisms, similar exploitation, both concentrated resources and power at the top. Both created hierarchies that benefited some at the expense of others. The Commonwealth was larger 50,000 people versus the sanctuary's few thousand, but the pattern was the same. Rick's group, meanwhile, just survived. They found safe places, lost them, moved on, built relationships, tried to maintain some sense of morality and community, but never achieved the scale or stability that Negan did. They held on to their humanity, their choice, their dignity. But they paid for it in constant vulnerability, in the inability to ever truly rest. So here's the theory seed I'm planting. Intelligence, in Negan's case, meant thinking 10 steps ahead. Not just how do I survive today, but how do I build a system that sustains thousands of people over years. He understood resource management, human psychology, power dynamics, and organizational structure. He built infrastructure, while everyone else was still fighting walkers, day to day. Was the sanctuary evil? Absolutely. The exploitation, the coercion, the violence used to maintain control, all of it was morally indefensible. But was it also organized dystopia that actually functioned in a world where almost nothing else did? That's harder to deny. And that's what makes Negan so complicated. His intelligence was real. His cruelty was also real. The question is whether the first can ever justify the second. Season 7, Episode 11, Hostiles and Calamities, is where we see Negan's ability to read people in real time, and it's fascinating to watch. Eugene arrives at the sanctuary terrified, expecting to be tortured or killed. Instead, Negan gives him a tour, tests him with questions about walker behavior, and within minutes identifies exactly what Eugene is: brilliantly intelligent, profoundly cowardly, and desperate for comfort and validation. So Negan doesn't threaten him. He offers him everything Eugene never had in Rick's group: respect for his mind, luxury accommodations, gourmet pickles, video games, status. When the fence walkers start decaying and falling off their posts, Eugene improvises a solution: to pour molten metal over their heads to preserve them. It's clever, resourceful, exactly the kind of practical intelligence Negan values. And Negan rewards him lavishly. Here's the thing: Eugene was genuinely swayed. Actor Josh McDermott confirmed in interviews that Eugene wasn't playing a long con. He was firmly Negan during that period, motivated by fear and comfort rather than ideology. Negan converted him through understanding exactly what he needed: not violence, not ideology, but safety and recognition. But, and this is important, Eugene ultimately betrayed Negan in the Season 8 finale. He sabotaged the ammunition, making the Savior's guns backfire during the final battle. The conversion was real, but it was also shallow. Negan had Eugene's compliance and his skills, but he never had his loyalty. The moment the cost of staying became higher than the cost of leaving, Eugene chose Rick's group. This raises a question I keep circling back to. How many others did Negan read this perfectly? How many people submitted not because they believed in his vision, but because he understood their weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision? The answer is complicated. Some genuinely believed. Some submitted out of fear. Some, like Dwight, were coerced and became secret traitors. Dwight never converted. His wife Sherry became one of Negan's wives to save Dwight's life after they fled the sanctuary. Negan burned half of Dwight's face with a hot iron as punishment. Dwight stayed, appeared loyal, and fed intelligence to Rick's militia throughout Seasons 7 and 8. Negan thought he'd broken Dwight into submission. He was wrong. Gabriel was another case where Negan's reading failed. After they got trapped together in a trailer during Season 8, Negan tried to manipulate Gabriel through confession, through shared vulnerability. Gabriel listened, but he never converted. He stayed opposed to Negan throughout, working against him whenever possible. So Negan's intelligence wasn't perfect. He understood people well enough to exploit them, but not always well enough to earn genuine loyalty. He converted through comfort and fear, not through conviction. And in a world where loyalty could mean the difference between life and death, that limitation mattered. But still, the fact that he tried, that he understood different people break in different ways and tailored his approach accordingly, that's sophisticated psychological manipulation. Most villains in The Walking Dead used blunt force. Negan used precision, and even when it didn't work perfectly, even when people like Eugene eventually betrayed him, he still maintained control longer than anyone else had managed. All-Out War in Season 8 is where Negan's strategic intelligence really gets tested. He's outnumbered significantly. Rick has formed a coalition of Alexandria, Hilltop, and the Kingdom 3 communities working together against the Saviors. By all conventional logic, Negan should lose quickly. But he doesn't. He almost wins. He uses walker herds as weapons, redirecting them toward enemy positions. He employs psychological tactics, exploiting divisions in the coalition, targeting leaders to destabilize their communities. He divides Rick's forces by hitting multiple locations simultaneously, forcing them to spread thin. And even when the sanctuary is surrounded and under siege, Negan finds ways to turn the situation to his advantage. The only reasons he ultimately loses are Dwight's betrayal and Eugene's sabotage. Dwight fed Rick's group intelligence about savior movements, ambush locations, weak points in their defense. Eugene, at the last moment, made the ammunition faulty, so the Savior's guns backfired during the crucial final battle. Without those two internal betrayals, the war might have gone very differently. And here's the thing. Even in defeat, Negan adapted. When Rick slashed his throat with that shard of stained glass at the end of Season 8, Negan probably thought he was dying. But Rick ordered Siddiq to save him. Carl's letter had gotten to Rick, convinced him that mercy mattered, that there had to be something more than just killing everyone who opposed you. So Negan survived. And instead of raging, instead of going down like the governor did, dying in violence and hatred, Negan evolved. He accepted imprisonment. He used those years behind bars to think, to reflect, to slowly become something different from what he was. The contrast is striking. The governor, when faced with defeat, went on a rampage, destroyed the prison with a tank, killed Herschel in cold blood, died attacking the very people he'd already lost to. It was pure rage, no strategy, no adaptation, just the violent end of someone who couldn't exist without power. Negan, faced with the same kind of defeat, chose a different path. He could have died angry, could have spent his imprisonment plotting revenge, nursing grievances, staying exactly who he was. Instead, he started reading people again, but this time not to exploit them, to understand them, to learn from them. The pattern here is about adaptation when frontal assault fails. Negan lost the war. His system collapsed. His identity as the all-powerful leader was stripped away, but he survived. And in surviving, he started to question things he'd never questioned before. Was he right? Was Rick right? Was Carl right? That it had to be more than just surviving, more than just winning. He lost the war but survived to question who was right. And that questioning, that willingness to evolve even after total defeat, might be the clearest sign of real intelligence, the kind that goes beyond tactics and strategy into something deeper. The ability to recognize when you were wrong, when your whole worldview needs to change, when the person you were isn't the person you should be anymore. During seasons 9 and 10, Negan sat in that cell in Alexandria, and something unexpected happened. He kept reading people, kept understanding them, but now he was doing it from a position of complete powerlessness, and somehow that made it more impressive. There was a 6-year time jump between seasons 8 and 9. When we came back, Judith Grimes was about 10 years old, and she'd been visiting Negan regularly, bringing him food, talking to him, asking questions. And Negan became her confidant, her mentor in a strange way. He told her stories about Carl, helped her with math homework, offered genuine advice about the world she was growing up in. Michonne kept Negan alive specifically because his perspective had value. She didn't forgive him. No one did, really. But she recognized that someone who understood power, organization, and human nature the way Negan did could still contribute something, even from behind bars. That's a kind of grudging acknowledgement of intelligence that's fascinating to me. Think about the contrast again. The governor died raging, unable to accept that his power was gone. Negan evolved. He learned to exist without authority, without Lucille, without the saviors chanting, "I'm Negan," in unison. He became, in some ways, more himself than he'd ever been. Just a man in a cell, talking to a kid who'd been born into a world he helped break. And the relationship with Judith wasn't manipulation. It was genuine. When Negan saved Judith during the blizzard in Season 9's mid-season finale, Evolution, risking his life to get her to safety, it wasn't strategic. It was care. Real care for a child who reminded him of Carl, who represented the future he'd almost destroyed. This is where intelligence becomes something more than tactics. It becomes adaptability. The ability to recognize that the person you were, the leader who ruled through fear, who built an empire on exploitation, that person doesn't have to be who you are forever. You can change. You can grow. You can learn from the people you once tried to control. Could you learn from someone who did what Negan did? That's the question the show is asking. And the answer seems to be maybe, if they're willing to actually change, if they're capable of recognizing their own flaws, if they can evolve beyond who they were. Negan in prison wasn't the same person who lined Rick's group up and killed Glenn. He still had that strategic mind, that ability to read people and situations, but he was using it differently now. Not to dominate, but to connect. Not to control, but to understand. And that shift, from intelligence in service of power to intelligence in service of growth, that's what redemption actually looks like when it's real. Season 10 gave us one of the most complex tests of Negan's intelligence, infiltrating the Whisperers. Back in episode 4, Silence the Whisperers, Carol secretly freed Negan from his cell and sent him on a mission to infiltrate Alpha's group and kill her. It was a desperate gamble. Carol was consumed by grief and rage after Alpha killed her adopted son Henry, and she saw Negan as a weapon she could point at the enemy. But here's where it gets interesting. Negan had to become a Whisperer convincingly enough that Alpha trusted him, while Beta Alpha's second-in-command remained hostile the entire time. Beta never bought it. He told Negan directly that he'd never be one of them, try to get him killed by leaving him alone overnight with only a pocket knife, maintained constant suspicion and antagonism. But Negan didn't need Beta's trust. He went straight for Alpha. In Season 10, Episode 9, Squeeze, Negan proved his worth by outing Gamma as a spy when she was secretly communicating with Aaron. It was a betrayal that cemented his position with Alpha. And then he did something even more unexpected. He became the first Whisperer to be intimate with Alpha, breaking her own rule about emotional and physical connections. He got close to her, not through ideology. He never actually believed in the Whisperer philosophy, but through understanding what she needed. Someone who saw her as more than just the fearsome leader. Someone who treated her like a person. And then, in Episode 12, Walk With Us, Negan delivered. He lured Alpha away from her people, made her let her guard down, and slit her throat, cut her head off, and rolled it to Carol's feet. "Took you long enough," Carol said. The whole plan had been orchestrated by Carol from the start, and Negan had executed it perfectly. The pattern here is chameleon adaptation to any social structure. Negan joined the Saviors and built a cult of personality. He sat in prison and became a mentor to children. He wore walker skin and walked among the Whisperers convincingly enough to get close to their leader. Each time, he read the culture, understood what it valued, and became whatever he needed to be to survive and achieve his goals. But here's the thing. He gained one leader's trust while her lieutenant wanted him dead. That's a precarious position. It requires constant vigilance, perfect performance, the ability to maintain a cover even when someone powerful is actively trying to expose you as a fraud. Beta never stopped being a threat. Alpha's trust was conditional, built on Negan's ability to prove value repeatedly. And through all of it, Negan waited. He didn't rush. He didn't strike before the perfect moment. He endured Beta's hostility, played the role, and struck only when Alpha was completely vulnerable. That's strategic thinking, under constant pressure. That's intelligence that goes beyond just being smart. It's the ability to operate in hostile territory, maintain discipline, and execute when the opportunity finally comes. He gained Alpha's trust not through ideology, but through understanding what she needed emotionally. And he maintained his cover despite Beta's constant suspicion. That's sophisticated work. So let's build the core theory. Negan is strategically the smartest character in the Walking Dead universe. Not the most moral, not the wisest, but in terms of tactics, psychology, and systems thinking, he outperforms everyone else we've seen. But, and this is crucial, he lacks what Rick had and what Herschel embodied. Rick had moral intelligence, the ability to make decisions that balanced survival with humanity, that built communities people actually wanted to be part of rather than feared to leave. Herschel had wisdom, the understanding that some things matter more than survival, that holding on to your soul is worth the cost, even when it makes you vulnerable. Let me compare Negan to other intelligent characters. Eugene has technical intelligence. He understands science, chemistry, engineering. He can solve practical problems that require specialized knowledge. Carol has survival intelligence. She adapts. She improvises. She finds ways to stay alive when everyone else dies. Michonne has tactical intelligence. She reads situations, makes strategic decisions in the moment, leads effectively in crisis. But Negan? Negan thinks like a chess grandmaster, while everyone else thinks like warriors. He sees 10 moves ahead. He builds systems that outlast individual battles. He understands that controlling people's minds is more powerful than controlling their bodies. He recognizes that fear, combined with comfort, can create compliance, where violence alone creates resistance. The evidence is clear. He built an empire that lasted years. He lost a war against a coalition of 3 communities, but still almost won. He survived imprisonment and earned partial redemption. He infiltrated a hostile group and assassinated its leader, while her lieutenant actively tried to expose him. That's a track record of strategic success that no one else matches. But here's the complication. Rick's kill count is approximately 3,070 people versus Negan's roughly 230. Rick killed more than 10 times as many people as Negan did. Now, most of Rick's kills were walkers, and most of Negan's kills were deliberate executions of humans. The moral weight is different. But it does complicate any simple narrative about who was more violent, who was more ruthless, who sacrificed more humanity for survival. Rick made ruthless decisions. The preemptive massacre at the satellite outpost in Season 6, where Rick's group killed dozens of sleeping saviors, was strategic genocide. They didn't know for certain those people were threats. They assumed, and they killed based on that assumption. It was efficient, it was tactical, and it set off the chain of events that led to Negan's retaliation. So here's my question. Is ruthless pragmatism to intelligence? Or is it just survival instinct dressed up in strategy? Does thinking 10 steps ahead make you smart, or does it just make you good at predicting violence? Is Negan intelligent because he built systems, or is he just someone who understood that cruelty with infrastructure lasts longer than cruelty alone? I think the answer is both. He's genuinely intelligent. The strategic thinking, the psychological manipulation, the systems building, all of that requires real cognitive sophistication. But intelligence without empathy, without wisdom, without moral grounding, that kind of intelligence wins battles, but loses wars. It builds empires that eventually collapse because they're built on fear and exploitation, rather than genuine cooperation and shared purpose. Negan was smart enough to build the sanctuary. He wasn't wise enough to build something people would fight to preserve rather than fight to escape. Let's look at a pattern across all the major villains in The Walking Dead. The Governor, Alpha, and Negan each represented a different approach to post-apocalypse survival, and each failed in different ways. But Negan's system lasted the longest and supported the most people. That's not nothing. The Governor built Woodbury on a cult of personality and direct control. He maintained one fortified town through deception, keeping the zombie apocalypse's full reality from residents, entertainment, gladiator fights, walker fish tanks, and personal charisma. When challenges arose, he solved them through direct violence or expulsion. And when his power was threatened, he went on a revenge mission that destroyed both the prison and himself. His system lasted maybe a year or two before collapsing entirely. It was too dependent on him personally, too fragile, too built on lies that couldn't be sustained. Alpha and the Whisperers chose anti-civilization. They rejected walls, agriculture, human connection, everything that defined pre-apocalypse life. They wore walker skin and lived like animals, believing that humanity's attempt to cling to the old world was what made them weak. It was ideologically consistent, philosophically rigorous even. But it was also brittle. Because humans aren't actually animals, and denying fundamental human needs for connection, for meaning, for hope, creates its own kind of weakness. The Whisperers lasted maybe 3 years before Negan killed Alpha, and the whole system fragmented. Without their leader, without that ideology to bind them, they scattered. Negan's sanctuary lasted years at minimum 3 or 4, possibly longer depending on how you count, from its founding to its fall during all-out war. It supported thousands of people through a tribute network spanning multiple communities. It had sustainable resource extraction, clear hierarchies, infrastructure maintenance. It was evil, exploitative, built on terror and coercion. But it functioned. And it functioned at a scale no one else achieved until the Commonwealth appeared in Season 11. Here's what Negan understood first. Organization matters more than ideology. Fear works, but only if combined with structure. You can control people through violence, but you maintain control through systems that make submission seem safer than resistance. The theory I'm building is this. Negan saw post-apocalypse reality before the heroes did. Rick was still trying to find safe places and defend them. Daryl was trying to protect the people he cared about. Michonne was trying to preserve some sense of justice and morality. All admirable, all necessary, but none of them were thinking in terms of large-scale organization, sustainable resource management, power dynamics across multiple communities. Negan was. From the start, he was building infrastructure while everyone else was fighting walkers day to day. But here's the alternative interpretation. Maybe his intelligence was just cruelty with infrastructure. Maybe the reason his system lasted longer wasn't because he was smarter, but because he was willing to do things others weren't. Willing to kill Glenn in front of Maggie. Willing to take women as wives through coercion. Willing to burn Dwight's face for the crime of leaving. Maybe what looks like intelligence is just ruthlessness that happened to scale well. I think both can be true. He was intelligent and cruel. The intelligence allowed him to build systems. The cruelty powered those systems through fear. Neither works without the other in the specific way Negan deployed them. And it's worth noting, Dwight never converted. He was coerced, stayed under duress, became Rick's spy the first chance he got. Gabriel never converted either. Negan manipulated him, but Gabriel remained opposed throughout. Negan's intelligence had limits. He could break people, exploit them, use them, but he couldn't always earn genuine loyalty. And in the end, that limitation destroyed his empire. Dwight's betrayal and Eugene's sabotage weren't failures of Negan's strategy. They were failures of his ability to inspire anything beyond fearful compliance. Season 11 gave us a different Negan, married to Annie, with a son named Joshua, trying to build a quiet life in a community that didn't want him. And Season 10's Episode 22, Here's Negan, gave us the backstory that explains everything about who he became and why. Before the outbreak, Negan was a high school gym teacher. Not a soldier, not a strategist, not anyone particularly special, just a guy who taught teenagers and had a wife named Lucille, who he loved but didn't always treat well. When Lucille got pancreatic cancer in the early days of the apocalypse, Negan tried everything to get her the medicine she needed, and he failed. She died, essentially by suicide, choosing to end things on her terms rather than suffer through the final stages. Negan's grief turned him into someone else. The baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, named Lucille after his wife, became his identity. The cruelty, the system building, all of it was grief and guilt transformed into power. He was trying to never feel powerless again, never lose something he couldn't protect, never be the man who failed to save the person he loved most. And in episode 22, we see him retrieve the original bat years later. It's deteriorated, falling apart. He uses it one last time to kill a walker, and it breaks, so he burns it. A symbolic cremation, finally letting go of his wife and the identity he built around losing her. That burning is everything. It's Negan recognizing that being the smartest, being the most powerful, building the most sustainable system, none of it brought Lucille back. None of it made him happy. None of it gave him peace. He won battles and lost a war that actually mattered, which was the war inside himself. The pattern here is, smartest doesn't mean best. Rick died trying to build bridges between communities, literally and metaphorically. He sacrificed himself to save people, to prove that cooperation was possible, that there could be something after the violence. Negan lived, but he carries guilt for every person he killed, every choice he made, every act of cruelty he committed in service of his system. Intelligence without empathy means winning battles but losing wars. Negan built an empire. It fell. He survived, but at what cost? The person he was before Lucille died, that person is gone. The person he became after that person did terrible things. The person he's trying to become now, with Annie and Joshua, that person is haunted by both the loss of who he was and the weight of what he did. Theory conclusion. True intelligence isn't just strategic thinking. It's knowing when strategy isn't enough. It's recognizing that some things matter more than survival, more than power, more than winning. It's understanding that the smartest choice sometimes is admitting you were wrong, changing who you are, letting go of the identity you built around never being vulnerable again. Would you rather be smart like Negan or good like Rick? That's the question the show is asking. And honestly, I don't think it's an either or. I think the answer is you need both. Rick's goodness without strategic thinking gets people killed. Negan's strategic thinking without goodness builds systems people fight to escape. You need the intelligence to survive at scale, combined with the wisdom to know what's worth surviving for. And maybe that's what Negan is finally learning. Maybe intelligence transformed means understanding that your mind, your ability to read people and build systems and think 10 steps ahead, all of that is a tool. And tools can be used to exploit or to protect, to dominate or to serve, to build empires or to build families. The Walking Dead. Dead City launched in 2023, and 2 seasons later, with a third confirmed, we're seeing Negan's intelligence deployed in a completely different context. Maggie's son Herschel gets kidnapped by the Croat, a former savior who's built his own brutal kingdom in post-apocalypse Manhattan. And Maggie, who has every reason to hate Negan, who watched him kill her husband Glenn with that bat, who has never forgiven him, Maggie forces Negan to help her rescue Herschel. Because she knows something important. Negan understands how people like the Croat think. He built the system the Croat learned from. His tactical mind, his ability to read people and situations, his strategic thinking, all of that is now deployed in service of protecting someone else's child instead of building his own empire. Annie and Joshua were sent to Missouri after Negan became a wanted man for killing people who attacked Annie while she was trading. He couldn't stay with them without putting them in constant danger, so he sent them somewhere safer and stayed behind to deal with the consequences of his actions. That's a different kind of intelligence than what he showed in seasons 6 to 8. It's the intelligence of recognizing when your presence harms the people you love, when the strategic choice is removing yourself from their lives to protect them. The pattern here is redemption through strategy applied to protection. Negan's mind works the same way it always did. He still reads people, still thinks 10 moves ahead, still understands power dynamics and human psychology, but now he's using all of that to save a child who represents everything he destroyed. Herschel Rhee, named after the man who represented moral wisdom in the early seasons, kidnapped and in danger because of the violent world Negan helped create. My prediction for Dead City's future: Negan's tactical mind becomes an asset rather than a weapon, but he can never escape what he was. The smartest thing he ever did might be learning when not to lead, when to follow, when to serve rather than dominate. But the cost is living with being right about the wrong things for so long. Can you be too smart for your own redemption? That's the question Dead City is exploring. Because Negan understands Maggie's rage, understands she'll never forgive him, understands that working together doesn't mean trusting each other. And he goes anyway. Not because he expects forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. That's growth. That's intelligence transformed from self-serving strategy to other-serving sacrifice. The emotional weight here is profound. Negan lives with the knowledge that he was smart enough to build the sanctuary, maintain it for years, almost win a war against a 3-community coalition. But he wasn't wise enough to recognize that the system he built would cost him everything that mattered. Annie loves him, despite what he was. Joshua will grow up knowing his father did terrible things. And Negan helps Maggie save Herschel, knowing that this act of redemption doesn't erase Glenn's death, doesn't restore what was lost, doesn't make him a good person. It just makes him slightly less terrible than he used to be. And maybe that's all redemption ever is, becoming marginally better, day by day, choice by choice, until the person you are bears less resemblance to the person you were. Let's examine the moral ledger honestly. Rick's group had high casualties, constant trauma, and communities that barely held together through sheer force of will. But they maintained moral clarity. They made hard choices. Sure, the satellite outpost massacre, exiling people who threatened the group, violent confrontations with the saviors. But those choices were made in defense, in reaction to threats, in desperate attempts to protect what they'd built. Negan's saviors had efficiency, sustainability, and lower casualty rates during the years of savior dominance. But that came at the cost of moral bankruptcy. Extortion, coercion, execution of dissenters, women forced into marriages, workers exploited for points. The system functioned, but it was fundamentally unjust. Here's the alternative reading I keep wrestling with. What if Negan's system would have worked long-term if not for Rick's coalition? The tribute network was sustainable. Multiple communities producing resources, sharing the burden, protected from walker threats and external raiders by savior patrols. Yes, it was exploitative, but it kept thousands of people alive who might have died otherwise. The price of that survival was freedom and dignity. But survival is survival. The Commonwealth in Season 11 proved that large-scale civilization could function, but it functioned through the same kind of hierarchy Negan used, just structured differently. The Sanctuary based its hierarchy on loyalty to Negan. The Commonwealth based it on pre-apocalypse profession and social status. Both created classes where some people lived in luxury while others struggled. Both used violence to maintain order when necessary. Both exploited labor from lower classes to maintain the comfort of higher classes. The difference is institutional versus personal. The Commonwealth's oppression was bureaucratic, structured, based on systems rather than individuals. You could theoretically reform the system without destroying it entirely. The Sanctuary's oppression was personal, dependent entirely on Negan's will and authority. When he fell, the whole thing collapsed. So here's my question. Was Negan's intelligence wasted on the wrong goals? If he'd used that strategic mind, that ability to organize at scale, that understanding of human psychology, if he'd used all of that in service of building something genuinely cooperative rather than exploitative, could he have created something that lasted? I think maybe yes. The intelligence was real. The system's thinking was sophisticated. The ability to read people and situations was exceptional. But he deployed all of that in service of control rather than cooperation, fear rather than trust, extraction rather than mutual benefit. And that choice, that fundamental moral choice about what his intelligence would serve, that's what destroyed the Sanctuary more than any tactical defeat. Here's the really uncomfortable question. If Negan had led Alexandria instead of Rick, would more people be alive? Would the communities be stronger, more stable, more capable of defending themselves? Maybe. Probably, even. Negan would have organized them more efficiently, maintained stricter discipline, made harder choices faster. But would they be free? Would they want to be alive in the world Negan created? Would the survival be worth the cost? Rick's group buried a lot of people, lost communities, lost homes, faced constant threats. But they chose their path. They maintained agency, dignity, the ability to say no. Negan's subjects survived at higher rates, but lost the ability to choose. And maybe that's the fundamental trade-off. Efficiency versus freedom. Organization versus autonomy. Survival versus the things that make survival worth it. I don't have a clean answer. I don't think the show does either. Both paths have merit. Both have costs. And the fact that we're still debating which was better, which was smarter, which was more moral, that's what makes Negan such a compelling character. He forces us to confront the question, what would we accept? What would we become? What would we sacrifice to keep the people we love alive? Think back to that smile in Season 7, Episode 1. Negan standing in the clearing with Lucille on his shoulder, calculated and calm. And think about the symbolic journey of that bat named after his dead wife. Weapon of terror, tool of psychological control, emotional burden, lost in defeat, retrieved years later, and finally burned, the ashes scattered. Negan walking away toward Annie and Joshua with empty hands. That transformation tells the whole story. Lucille the bat, not the woman, started as an extension of Negan's power. Every time he used it, He was asserting dominance, teaching lessons, maintaining the system through visible threat. It was control made physical. But over time, it became a burden. The weight of what it represented, all the people killed with it, all the fear it generated. Negan couldn't put it down because putting it down meant confronting what he'd done without the justification of power. When it was lost after all-out war, Negan had to learn to exist without it. Prison forced that. 7+ years in a cell, no Lucille, no saviors, no system. Just a man with his thoughts and the people he'd hurt walking free outside his bars. And then retrieving it in Season 10, Episode 22, that wasn't about reclaiming power. That was about closure. The bat was broken, deteriorating, barely functional. One last kill, then the burning. Finally letting go of the grief and guilt that created Negan the tyrant in the first place. Negan's intelligence followed the same arc. Survival tool, manipulation weapon, prison adaptation, infiltration skill, and now, in Dead City, redemption path. The same mind that built the sanctuary now helps rescue Herschel Rhee. The same ability to read people that broke Rick now serves Maggie despite her hatred. The pattern is clear. Being the smartest doesn't mean being right. Negan was intelligent enough to build an empire, strategic enough to almost win an unwinnable war, adaptable enough to survive defeat and imprisonment. But all of that intelligence didn't make him happy, didn't give him peace, didn't create anything worth preserving once the fear was gone. The next generation, Judith, Herschel Jr., RJ, Joshua, they need his tactical mind without his methods. They need the ability to think strategically, to organize at scale, to understand human psychology and power dynamics. But they need to deploy all of that in service of cooperation rather than control, trust rather than fear, mutual benefit rather than exploitation. That burning in episode 22 represents Negan letting go of who he was to become who he needs to be. Not the terrifying leader, not the imprisoned philosopher. Just a man who understands what intelligence is actually for. Protecting the people you love, building things that last because people want to preserve them, creating systems that serve rather than dominate. True intelligence is knowing when to stop being clever, when to admit you were wrong, when to recognize that all your strategic thinking, all your planning 10 steps ahead, all your ability to read people and situations, none of it matters if it's not in service of something good. Maybe the smartest thing Negan ever did was learn when not to lead, when to follow, when to serve rather than dominate, when to recognize that his presence sometimes harms more than it helps, and that the strategic choice is stepping back, sending Annie and Joshua away to keep them safe, working with Maggie despite knowing she'll never forgive him. The calculated smile from that first lineup versus the genuine smile with Annie and his son, that's the transformation. Intelligence got him to the top of a system built on fear. Wisdom got him down alive and gave him a chance at something better. And maybe that's the final answer. The smartest choice is sometimes admitting you were wrong. Not about tactics, not about strategy, but about what intelligence should serve, what it should build, what it should become when the war is over, and the only thing left is figuring out how to live with what you've done. Rest now. The question isn't whether Negan was smart, it's whether smart was ever enough.